I
Uh-huh.
do have one question. So
Yes,
about the
sir.
quiz, is it an open book quiz?
Yeah, yeah. It's always going to be open book.
Okay, just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, that's a good question. I can't police you guys, and how you use your resources for these things, nor would I want to. Um, and like I mentioned, maybe in the first week of class, it kind of feels like I'm giving away the candy store by having these open note quizzes. But you'd be surprised how many people just don't consult your book when they take the quiz. And so for diligent people who stay on top of the course materials, it shouldn't really be an issue. Um, but it's mostly just there to keep you accountable, learning the material from week to week, that kind of thing. Okay, so what we're doing today is we're going to introduce the Greeks, one of my favorite parts of Western Civ 1. Who knew that they have such an important lasting impact on Western civilization? So we're going to do that, and then I'll just kind of end by asking if anybody else has any questions or lingering concerns or something like that. And then we'll preview the documents for Friday. But it should be a pretty easygoing Tuesday. I am on like 4 hours of sleep, so I'm trying not to nod off. Also, if you hear like weird buzzing coming from the computer, it's probably people in like just outside of my office doing renovations or building some, I don't know. They're using power tools and it can get kind of loud. So I apologize in advance if it screws with the audio a little bit. Okay, so doing the screen share. I found that this is just the easiest way to disseminate information is to just, go by PowerPoint and then just share it. I will post it up on Blackboard when we're done here, along with the recording of me talking about this stuff. And you also have guided reading questions for the documents for Friday as well. So I think we're establishing a rhythm now with this class. We're getting a few technical glitches figured out and all that stuff. So, okay, the Greeks. Oh wait, I've got two people I need to admit into the waiting room, or from the waiting room. Welcome. Come join us. Come join our cult of history. All right, cool. All right, great. So the Greeks, they're the next important stage in evolution of civilization when it comes to Western civilization. We have to start from, the very beginnings of where the first kind of modern looking societies developed, and that was in the modern Middle East and Egypt. But as humans become more widespread throughout the world, they start setting up diverse communities. And the Greeks are really interesting for a few different reasons. They follow on the footsteps of the Mycenaeans and establish themselves across the northern Mediterranean area. That's kind of their home base, is this chain of islands in what we call the Aegean Sea. And also, of course, the Greek mainland as well, where we have the big city-states of Athens and Sparta, Corinth, and all the other ones that you don't really hear about because I don't know, because no one cares about them, I guess. The interesting thing about the grandkids or the descendants of the Mycenaeans is there's not a whole lot of them. Even by ancient standards, some of the largest civilizations had several million people. I mean, like I understand we're only in week 3, and we just started this class a couple weeks ago, and we kind of went really fast from like the development of agriculture and people being in communities of greater than a few dozen to like cities of like people of a few thousand, populations of a few thousand, and then now we're talking about the millions. But it goes pretty quickly in this class from a couple thousand BCE to the classical period where we start talking about people groups that have several million humans in them. But so anyway, by most standards, you know, there's not a lot of people spread throughout the Greek area. We're talking 2 to 3 million people in the Aegean Peninsula and in the surrounding environment as well. The crappy thing about Greece, though, is it's not a great place for agriculture. It still isn't. There's lots of mountains in the Greek peninsula, the Aegean Peninsula. A lot of mountains, rocky soil, not a lot of fertile farmland. And so it's just kind of hard, especially on the kind of the interior of the Greek mainland. It's hard to establish like widespread agriculture. So these people, just like their ancestors, turn towards the sea for sustenance, which enables them to then explore and colonize. Yep, I got ahead of myself. So lots of rocky soil in Greece, which is okay for growing certain things. Like you can grow some wheat, you can grow olives, like from olive trees, vineyards. Greek wine becomes kind of a specialty. You can grow some things, but in terms of like staple agricultural products that you can eat and have nutrition and calories, there's not a whole lot you can do. So this forces them to go outward from the Aegean Peninsula and look to the sea. With this kind of ingenuity, like they're forced to travel, they're forced to devise certain things to make their lives easier. Because of this challenge of they just can't just sit around and farm all day and get a stable source of food that way, the Greeks innovate in ways, especially in technology and in other ways as well, more so than other ancient civilizations. They become really good at developing pottery for storing vast amounts of goods over long periods of time. Pottery is really important. Pottery is like the pre-refrigeration technology, you know, of humanity. If you wanted something to keep longer, you stick it in a pot where it has limited airflow, and that keeps things from rotting and molding and that kind of thing faster. So the Greeks become really good at pottery, and they develop these ornate pieces of pottery that tell stories and have cultural figures on them. They end up selling, like exporting these pots and these vessels to other parts of the ancient world. And there's a few city-states that have like pottery manufacturing centers where their whole job is to develop these really fancy looking things and sell them to rich people across the sea. The Greeks are also really good at smelting bronze and eventually iron, because we're entering the Iron Age. So they're on the cutting edge of technology when it comes to precious metals for keeping and storing things over long periods of time. They also piggyback off of the Phoenician alphabet, which we talked about last week. So we get the development of the Greek alphabet, which is still around to this day, although it looks a bit different than it did a few thousand years ago. No one in Greece now, educated in the modern Greek alphabet, can look at like an original translation of Plato and be able to read it. Just like we can't read, you know, Old English, Beowulf or something. So the Phoenician alphabet becomes an important part of Greek culture because they take it and they make their own thing with it, and you get the Greek alphabet. And so they have a very efficient writing system. And then finally, because they're able to sail around and colonize, they are able to find good spots to start setting up lumber shops and lumber trading posts and things like that. You need lots of wood to build ships. And since the Greeks rely on their ships to go fishing, to sail, to trade, they colonize parts of the Eastern Mediterranean and set up deforestation centers where they're able to cut down lots of trees and make ships out of those. So in terms of ancient civilizations, the Greeks really have a good thing going. Despite their handicap of not being able to farm very well, they make up for that in a lot of ways, being able to push their technological innovations way past where other civilizations perhaps might have. So this map really quick gives you a good view. Anything in orange is where the Greeks settle and set up either permanent residences and like cities, or like trading posts and economic sort of mines or lumber camps for extracting raw resources. So we're talking like all the way east into the Black Sea, all around modern Turkey, Anatolia, of course the Greek mainland itself right there in the middle of the map. They colonized the boot of Italy, pretty close to where Rome ends up being developed. The island of Sicily, parts of North Africa, and even parts of modern France. So the Greeks are everywhere. And everywhere they go, they're spreading their culture, they're learning things, they're talking to each other, and they're developing a pretty robust classical society in the ancient world. The main way of organizing their civilization comes in the form of city-states. There's a few different ways to translate this. What we often reach for is the Latin word polis, which denotes city in some way, or it can be translated as like a community as well, like a broad community, the polis. But most of the time we just kind of, we talk about the Greeks in terms of city-states. In other words, these are cities, permanent residences, permanent dwellings, where the local community there develops its own independent society. So, you know, we'll talk about like Athens and Sparta. They're both Greek, but they have nothing else to do with each other. They're not ruled by a common king. They're not bound by the same set of laws. They understand each other because they speak the same language, but like Athens and Sparta are both two different polises or poli, right? They're two different city-states. Each of these city-states has its own unique features. They have their own set of governments. To use the Athens and Sparta model, Sparta has like a quasi-democracy, kind of. Not a lot of people are invited to participate in it. Sparta has two kings for some reason. Athens does not do that. They go full on democracy. So, you know, completely different. They have their own separate armies, you know, they have their own different economies based on their specialties, you know, banking or manufacturing or trading or whatever. Okay. But, you know, for the most part, each polis or each city-state has its own, have common features with each other. And this picture does a good job of kind of illustrating what like a model city-state would look like. There's the Acropolis or the temple that's built on the highest part, usually like a hill or something, with the highest part of the land. And then in the middle of the city-state, you have the city center, which is where the affairs of government take place. You have the markets set up there, you have courts of law. And those are different pieces of business from what happens in the temple and the Acropolis. The Acropolis can be a meeting place for lots of people, but usually it has kind of a symbolic religious role in the community. The city center is where all the business really takes place of governance and trade. And then you have, you will always see this, you have a series of walls sometimes more than one ring around the entire city, because in ancient warfare, before the time of like gunpowder and stuff, just erecting very large barriers to keep people away from you is just the best way you can defend yourself. You know, eventually we'll get like catapults and battering rams and things to like break down walls or gates to the city. But, you know, your best bet of staying safe from your enemies is just to build a tall wall around your city. And every polis has that. And then we have the outlying farmland where, you know, people perform any kind of agriculture that they can to help feed the city. Oftentimes, if it's close to the sea, like Athens, they'll have like a harbor built alongside the city-state, a place where the fishing can happen and things like that. So, you know, your polis is going to look more or less similar across Greece, but the individual characteristics of each city-state are all very different from each other in terms of their individual characteristics and societies. Polis, by the way, is a word that we still find in a lot of American cities. We've inherited this, you know, parts of this language from Western civilization. You know, Indianapolis, Minneapolis, you know, things like that. It denotes, you know, it's a city or a community of people. So even though these are all kind of different in their own little ways, you know, the book talks about Sparta being this heavily militarized society built on slavery and oppressing slaves. Athens is more geared towards trade and philosophy. But no matter where you're at in Greece, there's these shared characteristics that transcend city-states, right? They all have this common language. They all speak this form of ancient Greek. Corinthians can commune with Trojans. Spartans can talk with Athenians. Like they all have a common form of language. They all have also similar cultural characteristics too. There are things that bind them together outside of language, things like belief in a common system of values, what it means to be Greek. They have this kind of Greek identity that spans across the city-states. They all follow the same religious values, right? They all share the same pantheon of gods. And so even though you have like a place like, you know, Athens is named after Athena, and that's their favorite god is Athena. I know I keep going back to like Athens and Sparta, but like Sparta loves the god of war, Ares, you know. Even though they might have favorite gods in their cities, they all recognize that like there are multiple gods and they are all powerful. So an Athenian will, you know, pay respects to Ares, and Spartans will acknowledge Athena. It just won't be like the patron god or goddess of the city that they live in. And then one other kind of cool thing that binds all the Greeks together across this broad patch of the Eastern Mediterranean and Northern Mediterranean is every so often they'll get together and they'll have a contest, an athletics contest called the Olympics, because it's held under the shadow of Mount Olympus, which is a part of the Aegean Peninsula. So they'll have these contests every year or two where, you know, the greatest athletes from all the city-states are invited to participate, and they congregate in this one city, Olympus, and they have these contests of strength and endurance and speed, track and field and wrestling. Those are the two big kind of events. And it's a tradition that we've kept to this day, obviously, which is sad because because of the pandemic, you know, I think the Olympics were supposed to be held this summer in Tokyo or Japan. They got pushed back, which is really crappy. Summer Olympics are my favorite. So even though there's these kinds of like problems that they definitely will have rivalries with each other. The Greek city-states will go to war with each other. See the Trojan War as an example. Like they'll bicker and they'll embargo each other and they'll snipe and they'll have skirmishes and all these problems. But at the end of the day, they are all still Greek and they identify that way, right? They have the shared sense of Greek identity, this Greekness that, you know, you're always going to be a part of your polis no matter where you travel, but you're also always going to be Greek wherever you go. And that's pretty powerful. That's a powerful uniting thing. You know, identity is a very, very powerful thing, especially in the modern world, but it's always been that way. Where these people are able to find a common unifying factor. And these unifying factors are emphasized in the face of a common enemy, which we'll talk about more next week. All right. Well, I guess we're going to preview it now. I forgot I wanted to preview this now. Next week, we're going to talk about the Greek wars a little bit more intensely. It's all going to be about the wars of Greece because there's a lot of important things that happen there. One of the reasons why Greece stands apart from the rest of the ancient world is, you know, they're good at technology, they're good at trading and colonizing, yada, yada, yada. But their sense of Greekness and their values are antithetical. They are the opposite of a major civilization that's forming to the east called the Persian Empire. And you can contrast these two civilizations vying for supremacy in the West all throughout the classical era. You can draw lots and lots of opposites from each other, like I'm going to do right now. So if the Greeks were a series of decentralized societies, a bunch of little city-states that all did their own thing, the Persians are the opposite of that, where they are forming this ever-growing, ever-expanding empire of large patches of territory ruled by one person, the king. And they will come into conflict. These two forms of government and worldview will come into conflict often. If the Greeks are this tiny little plucky civilization out in the Mediterranean, the Persians are this massive empire ruled by this god king comprising tens of millions of people, including modern day Iran. They still call themselves Persians, by the way. They speak Persian in Iran. Modern day Iraq, so like the old Babylonian Empire gets taken over by the Persians. Egypt falls under the Persians as well. Bye-bye Egypt. Modern day, you know, Syria, Jordan, the Hebrews, land of Judea and Israel falls under Persia. So Persia is expanding westward and conquering, just steamrolling everybody they encounter. And then they meet the Greeks. And they're like, oh, okay, 2 to 3 million Greeks, not a big deal. We're going to take you over as well. And we'll talk about that more later. If the Greeks valued their independence, they valued, you know, the idea that each city-state could do its own thing and have its own society and its own set of rules and values. They were not out to conquer each other. Like whenever there'd be a war between these Greek city-states, it was normally over like securing a better trade deal, okay? Or, you know, getting revenge for some slight of diplomacy. But the Spartans were not out to conquer their neighbors, almost ever. You know, Athens was not out to conquer, you know, Corinth or Thebes or whatever. They'll fight, but they won't conquer each other. They value that independence even among their enemies. Whereas the Persians are the opposite. They just want to conquer and absorb everybody into their empire. And then finally, no matter where you find yourself in Greece, there's going to be some form of male participation in their government of their city-state. In other words, even in Sparta, which is the most militaristic, authoritarian, hard-nosed society in Greece, they have a limited form of democracy where men over the age of 60 can participate in a council and advise the king on certain things. Let alone, Corinth and Thebes and Athens, they have more robust forms of democracy. The Persian Empire does not believe in that. The Persians do not believe in that. The buck stops at the god king, and everyone else is just cannon fodder, right? Excuse me. So there are lots and lots of differences between these two rival civilizations that end up dominating the classical period before the Romans come along. And then the Romans just take everybody over. But right now we're focused on Athens versus Persia. Next week, we will talk about the ways in which the Greeks are able to meet this challenge of an empire that's trying to invade them with several million more people than what they have to draw upon for their manpower. We'll talk about the hoplites and the Greek phalanx formation of very disciplined, armed soldiers. This is just a preview of that. I want to spend more time next week talking about that. But just like everything else, there's very different styles of warfare between what the Greeks organize and what the Persians do. If the Persians were like, hey, let's take a few 100,000 guys and just throw them at the enemy, the Greeks are like, no, we want to actually train our soldiers to be elite fighting forces. And it works out for them pretty well. Okay. So a couple more things I want to talk about before we adjourn. The other notable thing that we'll talk about with the Greeks, and it'll kind of close out our 5-week period. In a couple weeks, we'll delve more into kind of the philosophical, cultural part of Greece. But it's important too to know that Greek civilization believed in making the world a better place and trying to understand humanity's role in the world. This derives from a lot of their literary tradition and their poetic tradition. You can't talk about Greek culture and poetry without talking about Homer, right? Have you guys read either the Iliad or the Odyssey, maybe in high school or another English class? Yeah.
Yes, I have.
Yeah.
Some of the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Yeah. What did you think of it? What was it? Was it kind of cool? Was it hard to understand? What were your impressions of that?
Well, I would say it was a bit all over the place, but it did have consistency in that it always has the same themes of gods getting involved in moral affairs and how they need to learn lessons and be punished if they don't properly.
Yeah, good. It's the gods' world, and we're just living in it. Is the underlying theme of Homer's poems. So yeah, the Iliad's about the Trojan War, and the gods are equal players just as much as humans. And then the Odyssey is about Odysseus's adventure back home after the Trojan War is concluded. It is kind of big. It's hard to understand what's going on sometimes, but the gods are main characters, just like humans are. We don't know a lot about Homer, the guy who wrote these two epic stories. We know he is Greek. We think maybe that he was a real person. What's more likely, in fact, though, is that he was probably several people. The idea of Homer as being this genius guy who invented these stories may not be accurate. legend has it that he's this blind genius who would just recite poems from memory and stories from memory. But in reality, it's probably a collection of people. And this idea of Homer is just a stand-in for the people who actually came up with these stories. But it's still fun to talk about Homer like he was a real person. Just like it's fun to talk about, King David of the Bible, or Moses, or, these other kinds of like very, very important canonical figures in Western history, despite there being very little archaeological evidence that they existed. They're still important. Okay, so lots of works are attributed to this person or character of Homer, whether or not he was a real guy. He wrote rhetorical speeches and political speeches. He wrote plays, some of which still survive, songs and hymns that can be used in religious environments. But, the Iliad and the Odyssey are his most important contributions. And the reason why they're important is because they place the emphasis of storytelling on individual actors. So even though there are like these, Greek polises and these communities, and community is very important. I mean, the Iliad is basically a story of a bunch of individuals all doing their own thing, following their own consciences or their own egos, and trying to get what they want. The Odyssey is a story of one guy and his journey back home. And so the spotlight is on individual people as being important. And that's a very Western thing, right? Contrast that with Eastern traditions in the ancient history of China, or even modern China, or Japan. The emphasis is on the collective. It's on the community, not the individual. But it's different in the West. In the West, we have a different cultural heritage where the emphasis is on you as a special snowflake person who has their own thoughts and feelings and ambitions and desires. And that's Western civilization in a nutshell, right? So I think that's important to point out. I just got a new translation of the Odyssey. It was published a couple years ago by Amy Wilkerson, I think. So the stories are still around and they're still being told. They're very important. Okay, Socrates is another important part of Greek culture. He's an Athenian philosopher who makes his living not by farming or mercantile stuff, but by teaching. He's one of the first like professional teachers that we know of, anyway. That's recorded. We're pretty sure Socrates was a real guy, although it's hard to tell because we don't have any of his own writings. Everything we know about Socrates comes from one of his students named Plato. But anyway, this kind of legendary figure of Socrates is, he's this Athenian philosopher who would go around teaching in the city-state of Athens. And he would teach on such things as the philosophy of ethics, right and wrong. How do we know what's right and what's wrong? Or the idea of good and evil, does that exist? He would teach about reason. How do we know what we know in the world? Well, a lot of it can be traced back to rational thought, not just believing anything that we want to believe, but by looking for evidence and making reasoned arguments, just like you guys did in your papers last week. Epistemology. Epistemology is the study of knowledge, or the philosophy of knowledge. Like how do we actually know what we know? How do I know that I exist as a person? Well, it's because I can see my fingers here wiggling in front of me. I'm interacting with the world around me. I asked a question a few minutes ago and been responded. Therefore, I can be pretty sure that I'm a real person that exists in the world. And I'm simplifying epistemology a lot there. I'm not a philosopher, but it's this kind of deep thinking that asks really hard questions of one's role in the world. It's a very Western thing. Socrates develops a mode of teaching that's named after him. It's his namesake, the Socratic method of teaching, which is challenging students to think through problems and come to their own conclusions. And I hope I'm doing that a little bit in this class, at least in the writing assignments. I'll teach a class every couple semesters where it's like a seminar style class where we all kind of just sit in a tape, like around, we'll all just kind of circle up our desks and we'll sit around as kind of like a, Knights of the Round Table setting. And in a seminar, like all I do is ask questions of you guys, and you have to think through certain problems and come to your own conclusions. That's the Socratic method of teaching. It's not just giving you a book and being like, here, now you're smarter. It's asking you to think through problems and using your own life experiences to answer questions, or asking you to use evidence to answer broad questions that are posed to you. So it's a revolutionary style of teaching, and it teaches the skills that I think are very important. They're important in any time, in any age, in any career path, of critical thinking, argumentation, and trying to persuade, arguing to persuade other people that you know what you're talking about and they should come around to your way of thinking. That's the Socratic method. And that's what a college education is, at least in part, founded on. You guys being in college courses are automatically more equipped to handle the rigors of the world because we force you to encounter tough questions in a classroom setting. And that's good. That's good for your minds. It expands your minds, and it makes you better people. And that's what Socrates was all about, was making better citizens. His student Plato kind of carried on this tradition. Socrates dies by committing suicide, but it's forced suicide. In other words, he's more or less executed by the government of Athens because he's asking too many questions of the young people of Athens. He's asking them perhaps to question why the gods exist. Like, why should we worship these gods? How do we know the gods exist? And those are dangerous questions to pose. So Socrates is executed by forced ingestion of poison. He has to drink the poison cup himself. And one of Plato's students, or one of Socrates' students, is named Plato, and he documents the whole thing. He writes about the death of Socrates. Socrates' apology is one of the last things, it's his last words before his death, is one of the documents you'll read for this Friday. So Plato is there chronicling his teacher in all the ways that he can before he dies. One of the things that Plato writes, though, that is kind of his own invention, and it does take the form of Socrates talking to people, but this is kind of Plato's thing, is it's a book called The Republic. And in it, he starts asking, just like Socrates is asking people to question, like, what is goodness? What is truth? How do you know things exist if you can't see them? Like, he's asking all these kind of deep, tough questions. Plato goes into the realm of politics, and he goes, what constitutes a good government? What would make the best possible collection of laws and balancing freedom versus like the rule of law? How do we do that? And in so many words, he comes to the conclusion, and you should read the Republic on your own. It's a trip. But Plato, being a philosopher, kind of self-deals a little bit, and he comes to the conclusion, like, you know what? The best form of government would be a government ruled by philosophers. Like, why don't we let people like me, who can ask these tough questions, other smart people, why don't we put smart people in charge of the government instead of a fleet of ass kissers and yes men who bow before a king? Like, maybe he's like in so many words, he's like, maybe the president, before we elect like people to be president or senators, maybe they should take like an IQ test, or maybe we should like judge them not on the ability of them to like insult each other the best, but in giving us like good ideas for how they would run the government. So anyway, and I'm oversimplifying the Republic a lot, but it's basically Plato saying, we don't have to settle for like dictators and kings and strongmen. Like, people can maybe rule themselves by law. We just have to have the right people doing it. So, all right. Well, that's basically what I have, guys. That's an introduction to the Greeks. I will post this up on Blackboard, and you can refer back to it. Your readings for this week are pretty brief. It's just introducing Athens and Sparta and Minoa and a few aspects of Greek culture. Your quiz is due at the end of Friday, and it's going to be on the textbook readings. The readings for this week on the Greeks, and also last week as well. So, and I think I split it up between, it's like the 10 questions are split evenly. So 5 questions on last week and 5 questions on this week's readings. Yep, that's what I got for you. There are guided reading questions too when you tackle the documents. Check out Blackboard for week 3, and we'll have a robust discussion on Friday. And those guided reading questions should help you think through the main ideas for the documents. So you're not just reading these and be like, what do I do with this? Use those questions to help you think about things. Are there any questions before we go? Cool. All right. Well, thank you all. I'm hoping this is an enlightening and satisfying experience. Emulating a classroom. If you have any questions, let me know. I'm going to log on to office hours here in 15 minutes, or send me an email. But otherwise, I'm going to try and get your papers graded as soon as I can. All right. Have a good one, guys. I will see you on Friday.